Thank you for joining us today. It's my pleasure to welcome us all and get us started. My name is Dr. Michael Lovick-Collier. I serve as the Assistant Vice President for Mission and Ministry. And along with the Center for Catholic Thought and Culture, we are one of the co-sponsors of today's event and of this three-part series, which we've titled Indifference is Not an Option, Pope Francis, Fratelli Tutti, and Solidarity. Recognize many of the names on the call as people who have been with us for the last 2 weeks, which is great. We're really glad to have you back, and perhaps there's some new people as well. We're really happy to have you if you're joining for the first time. The previous two series speakers are on YouTube, so you can always catch up. But we're really delighted to have you with us today for what promises to be an outstanding talk that'll be given by Father Joe Chinnici, for the President Emeritus at the Franciscan School of Theology. As you go ahead and get settled in, I encourage you to keep yourself muted and also to set your Zoom settings to speaker view. That way you can focus in on the speaker and not be distracted by everyone else. After about 40 minutes or so of presentation, we'll have time for question and answers, which will be managed via the chat box. So again, welcome. Thank you for joining us. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Jeffrey Burns from the Center for Catholic Thought and Culture.
Thank you, Michael. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Father Joseph Chinnici to you this afternoon. Father Joe, as we mentioned, is the President Emeritus of the Franciscan School of Theology, and he's the person primarily responsible for bringing the school down to the University of San Diego in 6 or 7 years ago. Dr. Joe is a major scholar in U.S. Catholic history with seminal works such as Living Stones, A History of Spirituality in the United States. And he has a forthcoming work called American Catholicism Transformed, from the Cold War through the Council, that will be published by Oxford University Press. This is a major new study that will undoubtedly change the way we understand the era of the Council and the pre-conciliar era. Joe is a teacher at the Franciscan School of Theology. He teaches church history. We teach a couple courses together, and I have to tell you, he's a tremendous teacher, so you're in for a treat this afternoon. But I want to end by saying that on a personal level, he is just an extremely decent human being and a good friend, and I really appreciate having him in my life. So I'm glad you're here today, Joe, and I turn it over to you.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff, very much. First, I'd like to begin simply by thanking University Ministries and Catholic Thought and Culture for inviting me to this, following some very, very fine speakers, prestigious speakers, really, that have already gone through a lot of the substance of Fratelli Tutti. And as a topic, I chose to look at it from a different angle. So I want to examine with you the spiritual roots of Fratelli Tutti. So we'll see where we go with this. It's a slightly different angle, but I think a lot of the principles I'm enunciating lie behind not only this encyclical, but the other works of Pope Francis. Let me share a screen then. Okay, I hope everyone can see that. The spiritual roots of Fratelli Tutti. So what I'd like to do is first, just very briefly, just to remind you, outline of Fratelli Tutti, then some significant facts, so we get into this. The convergence with two of the major spiritual traditions in the church, the Franciscan and the Ignatian. I will concentrate mostly on the Ignatian, even though I am a Franciscan friar, but the two come together very closely. More about that later. On Fraternity and Social Friendship was issued October 3rd, 2020, which you know. And it's composed then of these 6 chapters with a conclusion. In introduction, we note the word discernment, dark clouds over a closed world. Discernment is one of Pope Francis's favorite words. I'll return to it towards the end of this exposition and lecture. And then, of course, looking at the parable of the prodigal, the Good Samaritan, rather. Then his vision of society, pathways towards a shared culture, and only last does he put the role of religion. So clearly this encyclical is directed to all people of goodwill throughout the globe, and making the church at the service of the betterment of the world. That's the whole purpose. So it is significant. He begins many of his other encyclicals more directed to the Catholic community with the posture of evangelical conversion to Jesus Christ. So the fact that he puts the role of religion here in service to the previous elements gives us a very missionary view of the church, which is, of course, a common characteristic of both Ignatius and Francis. So those things, previous scholars have gone through with you, at least part of it, and this is just a reminder. Let me give you some significant facts, which for me, when I first started to read Pope Francis, it just struck me as very different, and his writings have seemed very different, also his approach. And I thought about this a lot and wondered, well, what's happening here? Well, he was born in 1936, and he entered the Society of Jesus in 1958. So he was a little older. He became provincial of the Argentine province and was that for 6 years, 1973 to 79, which would be the apogee probably of the post-conciliar period in the United States, and coincided then with the pontificate of Paul VI, with a little bit over to John Paul II. And then in 1998, he became Archbishop of Buenos Aires, and 2013, Pope Francis I. It strikes me very, very much in his writings that he is the first religious, that is a professed religious of a major religious order, to be Pope since Gregory XVI, 1831 to 1846. I think that is extremely significant. And we have to look at his religious background. The reasons are simple. Francis comes from a tradition in the church which is charismatic. It's based on the principle of a spiritual experience of Jesus Christ. At the center of his vision is the image and picture of Jesus as presented in the exercises. His foundation is Christological. It's not ecclesiological. Ecclesiology, the church, even though he's Pope, is not at the center of his vision. His vision is that of his relationship with Christ and the relationship of Christ to the world. That's very typical of religious life. That's one of the things. It's based on personal experience, the role of the Holy Spirit, the mission beyond those, beyond the boundaries of the local church, even though he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires, and the foundational charism of the religious order to which he belongs, which is the Society of Jesus. I think partially that's why nobody can understand him. And they just don't quite get the angle of where he's coming from, because we're not used to this type of approach from the papacy. So let's look at it more deeply. He was fascinated with the life of St. Francis also from the time of his novitiate, and people say this. He was influenced, the influence of the exercises of the spiritual life by Cardinal Jimenez de Cisneros in Spain influenced Ignatius Loyola. And there's a lot of convergence between the affective spirituality of Francis of Assisi and the affective, meditative, imaginative spirituality of Ignatius Loyola. Most historians would say that. In fact, the great Jesuit Hugo Rahner claims that the exercises are based on a scotistic, that is a follower of John Duns Scotus, vision of the world. So we're looking at the convergences between these two traditions, which often appear to be distinct. But we're looking at the convergences between them, one in the 13th century, one in the 16th century. He was a member of the Society of Jesus for over 40 years before becoming Archbishop. Those were his formative years. Those were the formative years of his vision, his experience within the context of a religious life. So he's a religious who has become Pope. Let's look at his convergence initially with Francis of Assisi. Just a second here. What I did is in preparation, and Fordham University has published 3 volumes of all the writings of Francis, Pope Francis, as Archbishop of Buenos Aires and then Cardinal. And it's quite lengthy, obviously, 3 volumes, but he goes through a lot of the talks and the works that he did in Argentina. I'd recommend this particular series. He writes in there to catechists in 2002, to worship is to draw closer to unity, to discover that we are children of the same Father, members of one family, as St. Francis discovered. To sing praises in unity to all creation and to all people. These are the part of the spiritual foundations of social friendship. It is to retie the bonds that we have broken with our earth, with our brothers and sisters. It is to recognize him as Lord of all things, kind Father of the whole world. A reference there to creation, or the principle and foundation, certainly of the exercises. And we know that Francis of Assisi is the patron of creation itself. It's expressed very clearly in Laudato Si, and also in the present encyclical Fratelli Tutti, but it comes out also in his pastoral action, as we'll see. So he shares with Francis of Assisi the path of the poor, the path of Jesus, the path of the affections, the path of example, the path of a teaching word, and the path of reform through mission in the world. All of those things come out clearly in Pope Francis's vision. I'll pick out a couple. Hearing the cry of the poor. Okay, now this is from Fratelli Tutti 48. We must not lose our ability to listen. This is Pope Francis. Saint Francis, quote, heard the voice of God. He heard the voice of the poor. He heard the voice of the infirm. And he heard the voice of nature. He made of them a way of life. My desire is that the seed that St. Francis planted may grow in the hearts of many. So you're looking at there at a dialogue, a colloquy, as the exercises call it, a colloquy between himself and the voice of God, coming in a very incarnate way through the poor, the infirm, nature. He doesn't put the church at the center. He puts the center in encounter with God's word throughout everything that is. Very interesting approach, particularly to the poor. And then he begins the Fratelli Tutti by several references to Francis of Assisi. Francis comes up at the beginning and at the end of the encyclical. So he cites, let all of us, brothers, consider the good shepherd who bore the suffering of the cross to save his sheep. Okay, that's Fratelli Tutti, let all of us, brothers and sisters. The Italian encompasses both genders. Blessed is that servant who loves and respects his brother and sisters as much when he is far away from him as when he is with him. Admonition of Francis of Assisi. Francis felt himself a brother to the sun, the sea, and the wind, yet he knew that he was even closer to those of his own flesh. Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti, he cites that. So we see him picking up some of the nuggets, I guess, that we have from the writings of Francis of Assisi, here called admonitions. I don't know who's advising him or if he's reading that himself. It could be either one or both. And then he picks up very clearly and cites, because of the world in which we live, when they go among the Saracens and other non-believers without renouncing their own identity, they were not to engage in arguments or disputes, but to be subject to every creature, human creature, for God's sake. A very, very famous line taken from the missionary chapter of the first rule of the Friars Minor, where you live more by example than by word. You speak only when moved to speak the words, and you do not engage in disputes or arguments. Would that all the friars had lived up to that, or that I had, but at any rate, there it is. And of course, we know how exemplary his performance is, Pope Francis, and how he puts the uh, role of example, the, if you want to call them, the photo ops, which are very real in terms of the embrace of the poor or the infirm or the washing of feet or the encounters that mark his dialogue with Islam. All of these things are very clearly part of the acted out by word and deed. In the picture, you see Francis of Assisi blessing the Sultan, Islam. And of course, this is one of the things that Pope Francis is doing. And the Sultan is dressed in white, which is a symbol of holiness. So the presence of God in all things, once again, which is very both Franciscan and Ignatian. The Ignatian inheritance is what we want to concentrate on. And this is, I think, what isn't emphasized enough when we're looking at him. Both of the traditions, the Franciscan and the tradition of Ignatius Loyola, began to recover in a very significant way their original sources and to relook at them with the tools of modern scholarship, history, and theology. And Pope Francis grew up at a time when there was a real revival of interest and commitment to understanding the exercises in their spiritual exercises of Ignatius in their original context. And what did they mean? And one of his major teachers at the time, passed on to him through his teachers in Argentina, was Gaston Fassard, a French Jesuit, who wrote a book called The Dialectic of the Spiritual Exercises. And Fassard sees this dialectic simply means two ends of a pole that are in deep relationship with each other. Grace and freedom, the grace of God and our freedom to respond. And Francis, this is what discernment is, the ability to respond to God's movement in the heart and in the world. So there's a great focus on the human will and the choice to respond to the encounter with God that comes initially from grace. This runs through all of his theology for Pope Francis. The large and the small, I'll pursue that a little bit here in a second. And contemplation and action are poles of the same experience. Action feeds contemplation, contemplation feeds action. Fassard also argues that history, the movement of history, the people in it, is the playing out of two liberties: the liberty and freedom of God to love and our freedom to respond. So we're always in a situation of encounter or dialogue or colloquy, always in a situation of examining around us and asking, how is God working there? in my own life, in the life of the society, in other people. Facade takes a step beyond the personalistic and individualistic interpretation of the exercises in a real breakthrough. And he applies the dialectic to society and politics, moving the tradition of the spiritual exercises from the axes of personal conversion to the axes of social conversion. So really, it seems to me, Fratelli Tutti is a call to social conversion, a call to social change. And you can see that in his friendship, his focus on friendship and his focus on the heart and the challenge to us to create new economic and political structures. Others have gone through that very well, but he picks up the notion that society itself is on a journey of conversion towards the kingdom of God. In Pope Francis, these emphases develop, and he has a lot of other help that we can't go into at the moment, but from Romano Guardini, of course, von Balthasar, de Lubac, and Pedro Arrupe, the general. He develops these into a theology of tenderness, a reading of history from the margins, a social philosophy of polarities and tension, a commitment to process, a cultivation of a penitential memory, and the notion always that God is greater than anything we can imagine or think or project, and the necessity of cultural discernment. I'm going to incorporate the primacy of the pastoral under the theology of tenderness. Let's start with the theology of tenderness and go through these. Obviously this is kind of moving through rapidly some very significant and deep themes. A theology of tenderness. It has Christological foundations, and this is typical of the Ignatian view. In fact, it's central to them. On the left, the picture of Francis of Assisi embracing the little babe in Bethlehem. This is from Francis's Christmas homily, December 14th, 2017. So he's Pope. He is the great God who makes himself small. And in his smallness, he does not stop being great. And in this great dialectic, he is small. There is the tenderness of God who is so powerful, so infinite, so omniscient, becoming small so as to be close with us, but he still remains large. The great that makes himself small and the small that is great. Christmas helps us understand this. In that manger, the little God. The conjunction of the two demonstrates for us, shows for us, performs for us, we who are small, the tenderness and mercy and compassion and desire of God to be with us. It reminds me of a phrase from St. Thomas in the first part of the Summa Theological, wanting to explain this. What is divine? What is the most divine thing? For the maximum, the large, to be contained in the minimum. This is divine, both together. His experience of conversion, his experience, his talk about mercy during the year of mercy, and it comes up consistently, is Christological. He's looking at how God is for us and how we need to be in the world. Tender, compassionate, making the infinite God small. So the governing maxim, which is quoted by Arrupe, and they all share together, is not to be limited by the greatest, and yet to be contained in the tiniest. This is divine, that the great makes itself small. This will influence, of course, his focus on small gestures, touch, listening, encountering, talking to people, conversing. All of that is contained in his great theme, encountering, encounter. All of those are particular, they're personal, they're attentive to the human being. Keeping our feet on earth to avoid losing our way to heaven. We go through the small to ascend to the great. Caelum animo Roma corpori. My heart and soul is in heaven, that is the love of God, but my body is in Rome, on earth. Or trust as if everything depended on God and work as if everything depended on oneself, a great Ignatian axiom. God's grace, our freedom. The great phrase, faith before being an answer is a question. How am I going to respond to God's grace in this person at this time, except by encountering the small and discovering within the small that which is great. Wonderful maxim that develops into a theology of tenderness. When he was a member of the society, Jorge Bergoglio wrote 3 different books on Jesuit spirituality. And of course, he was provincial, and that made him a formator of other Jesuits. So this has been at the heart of his ministry as a religious, and he would transfer it then into Argentina and now into the Universal Church. But you see again this notion of tenderness or mercy. It is very necessary that the one dealing with our neighbors in order to cure them should be like a good physician. His image of a confessional or action on the part of a minister is that of a physician. You have to diagnose the disease. You have to use the right medicine at the right time in the right measure. This is what pastoral means. You're adjusting to the person in front of you or the community in front of you. If you're a good physician, you don't go by the textbook only. You go by how does it apply in this situation? We see this coming out in his Amoris Laetitia when he talks about those who are divorced and separated. Can they go to communion? Well, it depends. We have to discern. They should neither be frightened at the neighbor's illnesses nor be repelled by their wounds. They should accept with great patience and gentleness their neighbor's weaknesses and importunities. To this end, they should regard our neighbors not as children of Adam and vessels of frail glass or clay, but as images of God purchased by the blood of Christ. And that would include all neighbors purchased by the blood of Christ. Note the focus then is not on people's sin, but on people's capacity or potentiality to receive the dialogue of God and even their carrying of the presence of the Holy Spirit. Very charismatic of the 2 traditions he's inheriting. A theology of tenderness. What does it mean to be human? He places at the center then of the encyclical the people of the Good Samaritan. And the thing he reacts to mostly is indifference. The people walking by did not respond to their interior summons. Note the interior summons. God speaks to us through the heart. They were prevented by duties, social status, a model of society based on professional status. This is all from Pope Francis. All those things that get in the way of us listening to the movement of God in our own affections. So they ask the question, why should I invest in this person who's slow, weak, or less talented than I am? Why not just throw him away, leave him by the side? But he will argue in Augustinian fashion and Ignatian fashion and Franciscan fashion, into each person is built the law of ecstasis, to go out of oneself in love. This is how we're built. And if we respond to that, we will recover kindness or mercy. And that's the parable. Now, Bishop McElroy spoke eloquently about that, so I'm not going to pursue it. But you see how it connects then with his theology of tenderness. Reading history from the margins. So he says in his most recent book, Let Us Dream, which I'd recommend to everyone, just came out. When God wanted to regenerate creation, he chose to go to the margins, to places of sin and misery, exclusion and suffering, illness and solitude, because they were also places of possibility. Places of possibility. The poor are places of possibility where grace can be encountered, but we have to go there. The sick are places of possibility. Social fracture is a place of possibility where grace can work. And we see that. We see here on the left, Jesus embracing Peter's mother-in-law rather than being indifferent to her and touching her. And on the right, Jesus casting out the demoniacs from the demons from the Gerasene demoniac. When nobody else can control, Jesus confronts him in places of social discord, exclusion, etc. That's where God wants to create. That underlies his commitment to the poor. Ignatius, in his autobiography, talks a lot about going to the poor. And of course, that's Francis of Assisi's hallmark. We see this coming out very clearly in his reflections on the midst of a pandemic. And in Fratelli Tutti, he contrasts what happened with the financial crises in 2008, that it developed into a greater individualism and an increased freedom for the truly powerful. He's reading history from a gospel point of view. And he wants to say the pandemic has opened up places of possibility for us because it has made us aware of our own poverty. It has exposed our vulnerabilities, our marginality. It has disrupted customs, routines, schedules, projects, family, relationships, technological solutions to every problem. Fratelli Tutti 32. The whole encyclical, in fact, has the reflections on the pandemic spread throughout it, as does the latest book, Let Us Dream. Wonderful reflections on the possibilities in this vulnerable space that the entire world has entered into, the possibility to create something new, because that's where grace can be encountered, through the vulnerability. And it breaks apart the structures of our economic and political life. I put up here the enchantment of consumption. Well, we see the substitution of a Christian liturgical calendar by Black Friday or Valentine's Day or Easter or Cyber Monday or Christmas or whatever, and the commercialization. We're well aware of that. I don't have to pursue all of that in detail. So, but consumption hasn't solved this problem. In fact, it's changed it. We've discovered maybe what we don't need, or we've broken some of our regular patterns of buying and selling. We've become, well, we'll see. And we've asked the question, what binds society together? Is it really bound together by a market model of exchange, or by a transactional model of society? I gave some of the characteristics culturally, how historians analyze these market model of exchange and transactional model of society. And some would argue that the market model of exchange or the transactional model of society have become the dominant social motifs of our age. And yet none of this could address the vulnerabilities. In fact, the pandemic has shown the gaps in social class, the gaps in accessibility, the gaps between white and black, the gaps between those who have access to vaccine and those who don't. Now the problem of all the rich countries buying up all the vaccines. So you can see those on the lower tier of economically are left out. What does that say? That weaknesses, vulnerabilities in a culture of consumption and a culture of the market or the culture of the transaction has just been blown apart. If we pay attention to what God is trying to tell us in the middle of this pandemic, if we read history from the viewpoint of God's presence and leading, this is applying conversion and its dynamics to society and politics and how they're moving. What has this pandemic revealed to us? So the discernment of God's working. Anyone who thinks that the only lesson to be learned was the need to improve what we were doing already or to refine existing systems and regulations is denying reality. So he sees a different reality. He sees society fractured in some of its basic patterns of relationships, buying and selling, consumption, and market exchange. Not that those are completely bad, but when they become the dominant and only models binding people together, that's a problem. So you see it on the left and you see the broken pictures on the right. Two revelations he talks about in the middle of this pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic momentarily revived the sense that we are a global community, all in the same boat, where one person's problems are the problems of all. Doesn't that reveal to us that we can only be saved together? We are brothers and sisters to one another. If that's the insight that is being produced by the pandemic, does that lead to action? Does that lead to a change in our worldview? Can we simply go back to the way it was before? We need to develop the awareness that nowadays we are either all saved together or no one is saved. Poverty, decadence, and suffering, one part of the earth, are a silent breeding ground for problems that will end up affecting the entire planet. Well, that comes through loud and clear from Wuhan to New York, to Paris, to Rome, to Istanbul, to Moscow. It's just there. And unless everybody gets the vaccine with migration patterns and everything else, the world's interconnected, how can we possibly go back to some kind of closed-in nationalism? The second thing, didn't the pandemic reveal to us that God continues to sow abundant seeds of goodness in our human family, Christian and non-Christian? We began to realize that our lives are interwoven with and sustained by ordinary people, valiantly shaping the decisive events of our history. So we're so dependent on workers in a grocery store on the right. We are so dependent on those who deliver from an Amazon warehouse, or on healthcare givers, or pharmacists, or doctors, or some passerby that brings us food. The pandemic has revealed one of the strongest elements in Franciscan spirituality and in Ignatian: relationality, encounter, conversation, colloquy. He's reading it from the viewpoint of a spiritual experience, the insight he gets. Today, we can recognize that we fed ourselves on dreams of splendor and grandeur and ended up consuming distraction, insularity, solitude. We gorged ourselves on networking and lost the taste of fraternity. We looked for quick and safe results only to find ourselves overwhelmed by impatience and anxiety. Prisoners of a virtual reality, we lost the taste and flavor of the truly real. So he's now discerning, what's the impact of this? This is what he sees. He's applying principles of discernment to a social situation. This calls for a rethink applied to the style of life, our relationships, the organization of our societies, and above all, the meaning of our existence. That's exactly what he's trying to do in Fratelli Tutti. Rethink the whole thing for the viewpoint of experience. And lastly, digital media lacked physical gestures, facial expressions, moments of silence, body language, and even the smells, the trembling of hands, the blushes and perspiration that speak to us and are part of our human communication. Digital relationships, which do not demand the slow and gradual cultivation of friendship, stable interaction, or the building of consensus that matures over time, have the appearance of sociability. They have some sociability, but not what we long for, which is human touch, facial expressions, moments of silence, body language. And we all recognize that. What does it tell us about our style of life and what we need to do? Another dimension of his spirituality, the dialectic that I referred to over, let's say, the great and the small, or grace and freedom. He has a dialectic of assimilation and openness, part and whole. This comes through very clearly in Fratelli Tutti. Again, his understanding of history and community and church actually is a composition of polarities that are held together by a magnetic force, but don't break apart. And their energy is achieved by their interaction, like north and south poles of a magnet. And you keep them in tension. You don't destroy either one. This is Pedro Arrupe, general. And Francis heard this speech from Arrupe. In every case, he's talking about enculturation. In every case, the Christian experience is that of a people of God that lives in a definite cultural space and has assimilated the traditional values of its own culture, but is open to other cultures, always moving to the universal from the local, or from the local to the universal, or from the individual to the community. There we see the dialogic nature, the encounter nature. It's applied now to the principles of enculturation. The Christian conscience, Christian experience helps a culture to assimilate universal values, which no one culture can exhaustively realize. Because we cannot realize it, we need the universal for fullness. Christian experience invites us to enter into a new and profound communion with other cultures. This is the dialogue with grace and freedom taken to a social level for enculturation, universality, and locality. Genuine enculturation supposes an attitude of Ignatian discernment, which is ruled by evangelical principles that I give to human values a transcendent dimension, that is, a dimension that goes beyond themselves. Discernment leads to readiness to learn from others. Am I so inclined to the universal that it dominates the particular? Or am I so inclined to the particular that my nationalism dominates my internationalism? And they're out of equilibrium. The discernment is to create the relationality. So he develops a culture of encounter. In Fratelli Tutti and Evangelii Gaudium, and in his many, many speeches to, for example, the European Union, he talks about a new image for the church and a new image for society is that of a polyhedron. I pondered this for ages. It represents a society where differences coexist, complementing, enriching, and reciprocally illuminating one another, even amidst disagreements and reservations. Again, the dialectic between parts making a whole. Each of us can learn something from others. No one useless and no one is expendable. We saw this playing out in the pandemic also, the same basic principle. That's why he's committed to a culture of encounter. It's not just personal encounter, it's social friendship on a political level, on an economic level, on a cultural level, so that we can have a whole that embraces everyone. This is the dialectic he's after. Conversion for him is a process occurring within history, not the individual, but it occurs within history, and it's central to his socio-political principle. We all live with a desire for change, and we all live in an individual moment. And if we're alive, we long for something greater, a deeper relationship, more love, peace, an end of class divisions, more equality, more inclusion, order, whatever it might be. Fullness, peace are always on the horizon ahead of us. And we live in the individual moment. We can never reach fullness, nor should we expect to, because we're on a temporal sequence. So he believes in process. That's why he starts lots of initiatives. People say, well, he's not concluding anything. Well, that's not his understanding. It's not Ignatius's understanding. It's not Francis of Assisi. We're on a pilgrimage. We are the small creature trying to express the great God. And we do that over time. And God's grace works with us over time. So we never capture in our space the ultimate, the kingdom, a peace, whatever it might be. But we continue on our pilgrimage, embracing our cross and move forward in time. Sometimes I wonder, he says in Evangelii Gaudium, and it's repeated in Fratelli Tutti, if there are people in today's world who are really concerned about generating processes of people building, as opposed to obtaining immediate results, which yield easy, quick, short-term political gains, but do not enhance human fullness. Process is very important for him. So I give one example only. The Vatican holding a summit on organ trafficking and transplant tourism, February 7th, 2017. What he's trying to do is start a process that affects all those people gathered together and makes the world more aware of human trafficking. He's not trying to solve the problem because it is too big or it involves too many people. And because that's not what life is. Life is complicated and it takes time. And so the Summit on Human Trafficking came up with some principles taken from the US State Department. And then in the eyes of God, this statement, each human being is a free person, whether girl, boy, woman, or man, and is destined to exist for the good of all in equality and fraternity. He wants to start a process that people take to themselves, convert, and form a better society, knowing that it will always be incomplete. And he does that over and over again. It's the embrace of the Iman, that he did, or it's the visit to the prison and washing of the feet, Those are all little actions, but remember our principle. The infinite is contained in the tiny. Cultivation of a penitential memory as we move along here. What does it mean to be a Jesuit? It means to recognize oneself as a sinner, but called by God to be a companion of Jesus, as Ignatius was. And you get on the left his own coat of arms, miserando atque elegendo, suffering, sinning, but chosen. And so the dialectic there of chosenness and the need for grace is constantly operative. And he wants the society itself to look at its ills. The bottom picture is the person at the recently formed National Museum on Slavery, where they have all the nooses and pillars hanging from the ceiling. And you see all those people that were lynched after the Civil War up to the 1960s, really, in various places in the United States. That's a real thing. Black Lives Matter. Truth and Reconciliation Community in South Africa. And then we in California certainly should remember what the California Code did to the Native Americans. That's Captain Jack at the Modoc War. And he remembers the Argentine Dirty War, which he had to live through when the church was divided by the anti-secularists, the institutionals, and the committed. The anti-secularists were those that wanted nothing to do with the modern world, and they made religious people, Catholics, archbishops, bishops, who made common cause with the right-wing military dictatorship. The institutionals were those who remained silent because they were more committed to keeping the church intact than in protesting social justice. The committed were the evangelicals. He himself committed to liberation and to people. He himself developed his own style within the context of that and tried to transcend all the parties. No hay cosa mayor para un Argentine que otro argentino. There's nothing more important for an Argentine than another Argentine. Again, the personalism coming through. And Deus, I like that picture, Deus semper maior. Belief in God who always surprises us. To be a Jesuit means to be a person of incomplete thought, of open thought, because he thinks and always looks to the horizon, which is the ever greater glory of God, meaning the glory of God, God's very self, is way beyond anything we can think or imagine. So every time we think we have it, we don't. And that forces us to be open culturally, socially, politically, open to how God is calling us. The exercises, I will consider how God labors and works for me and all the creatures on the face of the earth. He acts in the manner of one laboring. He's working for me in the middle of the pandemic, calling me to conversion. He's working for me in the collapse of consumeristic and market mentalities, calling me, laboring for my conversion through social change. God does not see with his eyes, God sees with his heart. And God's love is the same for everyone, regardless of religion. Even if there are atheists, his love is the same. Fratelli Tutti. Lastly, he reads social experience in the light of the gospel based on the Ignatian principle of discernment, consolation and desolation. And we've had lots of that in the pandemic or, in our economics and politics going back many, many years before Trump and beyond, and we've seen it. And some of it makes us consoled when we see the great goodness of the caregivers. Some of it makes us very distraught at the economic disparity that does not allow some to have access to good health care or vaccines. So he looks at these things, consolation and desolation, and refers to the bad spirit and the good spirit. Cultural polarization is born from the heart. It's the problem today, as he sees it, going back to the charismatic church, is in the affections. It's not in how we think. We can express ourselves as clearly as possible. We're not going to convince anyone who has a other point of view, because people don't operate from his point of view. The conversion doesn't occur on the level of thinking. It occurs on the level of action, affections, feelings. So our polarization is born from the evils within our heart. That's very biblical. And so he argues in Fratelli Tutti for the birth of political charity, a charity that expresses itself through the political apparatus, that all people are brothers and sisters, that initiates processes of social charity and small gestures of mutual care. He talks about the isolated conscience that refuses to let go of its acquired fortune, the ways it has done things that make its own ego, feed its own ego, to the humility, coming down, confessing faults, and giving ourselves to others. And then lastly, we are challenged to return to our sources in order to concentrate on what is essential: worship of God, love of neighbor, lest some of our teachings, taken out of context, end up feeding forms of contempt, hatred, xenophobia, or negation of others. The truth is that violence has no basis in our fundamental religious convictions, but only in their distortion. That's a powerful statement in Fratelli Tutti directed to the church. So I conclude here. Francis of Assisi's statement, when we look at the world, love is not loved, but love continues to love in the social and political experiences we have, if we pay attention. Love is coming to us, trying to change our heart and our affections, to develop social friendship. And from the spiritual exercises, consider what Christ our Lord suffers in his human nature, or desires to suffer according to the passage being contemplated, places himself in the gospel and does that. So you have a picture there of the scream and the picture of Guernica. We could do the pandemic, whatever you want to do there. So we develop our conversion in service to fraternity. The wellspring of human dignity and fraternity is the gospel of Jesus. From it arises, for Christian thought and for the action of the church, the primacy given to relationships, to the encounter with the sacred, to universal communion. Amen.
Amen.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Joe. Really appreciate your insights. We are going to now ask people if they have a question, if you would submit your question in the chat, and then we will allow you to voice your question. So I don't know if Emily is still here. Let me see here.
Oh, she's there. Yeah.
Okay, hold on so I can unmute everybody. Christine, are you still there?
Yes, Jeffrey.
Okay, can you allow people to unmute themselves?
Yes.
Okay, all right, Emily, can you unmute yourself?
Not yet. 1 second. Now she should be able to.
Okay, Emily, can you try to unmute yourself?
Hey, that worked.
Okay, great. You're on.
Well, let me start by saying thank you for that very rich presentation. I think I'm still letting it soak in. So I appreciate you letting me ask a question, but just know that this is a first and initial question. There was so much in that presentation that we could talk about. This is perhaps just a jumping off point. I was thinking earlier of the stamp collection that I saw being advertised from the Vatican that has many religious leaders with the Pope in a series of new stamps, and none of them are women. And I was thinking about that in connection with some of the presentation today. So my question is about, are there additional women spiritual leaders within our tradition that we could also be thinking about? So I was pleased that Pope Francis in his New York Times op-ed talked about the nurses who cared for him and saved his life, and how they demonstrated enormous, convictions, kind of going against their superiors in order to save his life, and how the nurses were an example of female leadership. And yet in hearing you talk about the spiritual roots of Fratelli Tutti, you were focusing mostly on male leaders. So Francis, Ignatius, Fassard, Arupe, Gordini, Fiorito, von Balthasar. And so I wonder what message you have for Catholic women reading Fratelli Tutti, especially women who are thirsty for spiritual depth and inspiration, and wondering if there are more resources within our tradition to honor the embodiment and leadership of women. Thank you.
A very good observation. Well, that's the tradition he's coming from, which is why I focused on that, but you hear him talk about his own sister, and there's a lot more going on. Two things. He has I was astounded really, quite a few pages in this recent thing where he's reflecting on the role of women in the church and women leaders in Let Us Dream, the path to a better future. And I think those are the most direct things he's said about the importance of women and the charism, expertise, etc. they bring to it. And he mentions in there that in looking at the church, he's trying to develop processes of change. So in fact, more women have been included at high levels of the Vatican in discussion under his watch, let's say, than ever before, in the hopes that that's forcing it to change through encounter, so to speak. So it fits in with his understanding of change. Now, there are plenty of women, of course, in the tradition we can look at, whether you're talking about Catherine of Siena or Teresa of Avila. And, he quotes some of the women desert mothers in some of his writings that I've read. It's probably the weakest part of his worldview to some extent, but on the other hand, he is developing things that will develop over time and change it. I've read his stuff, for example, to the Poor Clares. I mean, that's what I would be familiar with, all of whom are women, and again, he's calling them to these sorts of things, a missionary attitude, etc., and sees the contribution to the church. But generally, he's Latin American, he's an Argentine, and he's male. But I don't think we should read Fratelli Tutti through the lens of gender. I think that's specifically American issue. And Fratelli Tutti, the Italian itself includes men and women. That's the way they understand it. We don't understand it that way when they translate it simply as brothers, but that's how they understand it, So I think to read it through the lens of gender, which is a common way to do it, we miss the riches that applies to everyone that is embedded in it. That's my own view. To address it a little bit. That's a good question.
Thank you, Joe. We have a question from Sister Rebecca Zuro. Sister Rebecca, would you unmute yourself and ask your question to Father Joe?
Sure, thank you. I have been teaching in our formation house, and many times Fratelli Tutti comes to the conversation and listening to everything that we've been listening to. This is the third time that I participated, and I'm so blessed that I did. Can I say that this is an encyclical that is a Eucharistic encyclical, since it's not only universal, but also, at the end of Mass, they tell you to do and do good to others, live what you have participated in the Eucharist. I don't know what your intake is on that.
Well, he doesn't talk about the Eucharist in this encyclical. We can see that because, as I mentioned, he talks only about the church in the last chapter. So it's directed to all beings. So he's not specifically addressing the Eucharist at all. There's a direct connection, of course, between the celebration of liturgy and the social vision that he's bringing up. And that's social friendship and presence of God in all things, not simply the Eucharist, presence of God even in unbelievers, not simply the Eucharist. So there's a whole understanding of God's omnipresence and the Deus Simpus Maior, God always beyond our imagination, working for us in the world. Those are the axes of his interpretation. Personally, I think those principles can be applied to how we understand liturgy. And that would be, I think, very beneficial for the church and for the Catholic community. But it's a good question, good insight. Let's see if we can't put the two together.
We have a question from Steve Conroy. So Steve, would you unmute yourself and ask your question?
It's kind of tongue in cheek, but maybe not completely. Do you think this Jesuit Pope is really a Franciscan at heart?
No, I don't. No, I think he's pure Jesuit. I think there's a convergence between the two traditions, and it's very clear on a lot of points. But in many respects, his fulcrum of interpretation is the spiritual exercises, not the writings of Francis of Assisi. So, and that doesn't bother me. I used to eat dinner with the Jesuits, and it's a great tradition, but they're both charismatic and both have something to offer.
I can follow up though. Why do you think he chose the name Francis though, as a Jesuit?
Well, obviously, he claims that when Cardinal Humus, who was a Franciscan, his friend, turned to him in the conclave and said, "Don't forget the poor," he said, the name Francis, we all thought it, to be honest, in the Franciscan community, thought it was Francis Xavier, but he meant Francis of Assisi. And so I think his experience in Argentina and himself being in exile, from his own confreres, has given him a sensitivity to the marginal. And so I think that's why he chose Francis. But that's embedded in the Ignatian justice and peace and commitment for the poor. Liberation is embedded also in the Ignatian Inheritance. Good observation, Steve.
I have a question for you, Joe. At the end, you mentioned the quote of nonviolence. And there's been a lot of speculation about this Pope moving towards a more radical position on nonviolence and moving beyond the just war theory. What is your take on that?
I think the just war theory, in the context in which he's operating and concerned about, which is obviously nuclear war and terrorism, I think the just war theory is so fraught with difficulty today in terms of its principles. For example, the state determines basically whether war is just or not. And then you get into the struggle with conscientious objection. That's just one example. Appropriate authority. Well, today's world doesn't really have any appropriate authority. So I think and the state doesn't either, because they're all so politically interested, self-interested. So I think he's I think he's trying to inject into the church a much stronger view of the nonviolent tradition, and as John Paul II did, and that in the hopes again of planting that seed that will grow more and more as people look at the dynamics of modern terrorism and the dynamics of modern warfare simply don't allow that as a moral option.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
We have just time for one more question. We'll go to Michael Lovett-Collier.
Yeah, thank you for the wonderful talk. Very insightful and much to think about. The question that came to my mind at the beginning, you mentioned that Francis's identity as a member of the religious order and the way in which he doesn't put the church at the center makes it difficult for some people to understand where he's coming from or what angle he's coming from. And I see what you mean there, and I agree. But I also am aware that some people maybe do understand, but they just don't like it, and they're resisting that.
Yeah.
Could you say a little bit more? Is it about a lack of understanding where he's coming from, or a resistance to where he's coming from in his methodology?
Good question. I mean, at first glance, I'd say it's a lack of appropriate pedagogy. I don't think that we have done a good job. I'll put myself in there as a minister, a priest. I don't think we've done a good job communicating to people the importance of personal experience and our reliance on their personal experience of God, and how the church and the sacraments and the community flow from that personal experience, enrich it, and help it grow. I don't think we've related personal experience. The problem with the presentation of the faith is, to be quite honest, it's too cognitive. You think if you have a clear idea, you know what you're talking about. Well, the charismatic tradition of the church would not indicate that. They would say, no, you have to have this encounter and conversion, and you have to, and I'm convinced from working with people for many, many years that everyone has one, but we don't ask them how have they experienced God providentially in their life, through another person, through a grace that came to them, through a protection they had in their experience in life. We never ask that question. And we don't know how to move them from that question and their significant answer to the church's sacramental structure, dogmatic structure about Christ and God, about Trinity. We do a very poor job in that. But I'm convinced most people do have that. If you ask them about their experience, it may not come in language and forms that we recognize immediately, but I think it's there. It's related to love. They've been loved and they love. And if you start there, I think you could go to the church very easily.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. That's a wonderful note to end on. And I'm going to turn it back to Michael to wrap it up for us. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks for having me.
Yeah, as we come to the end, I don't know, Father Joe, if do you have a final word or a final thought you'd like to share with everyone before we conclude?
Absolutely nothing.
Okay. Well, thank you again from all of us for your great participation today and your sharing. We really appreciate your wisdom and expertise.
Okay,
I want to thank
nice to be
everyone.
with you. Thanks for attending. Appreciate it. Okay.
Just as a reminder to everyone that all three of our videos, this series will be on our YouTube channels, both for the CCTC and University Ministry. So be sure to check them out and share them widely. And please, if you're available tomorrow afternoon, Thursday afternoon at 5:30 is the next installment in the Laudato Si series. And you can find out more and sign up for that Zoom link on the CCTC website. Thank you all again very much for coming. Have a wonderful rest of your day.